Okay, so as the vellum was drying, I noticed something very different to everything I've seen before with leather. Now, with leather, as it dries, it shrinks, which is fantastic because what I can do is put leather on a book when it's slightly damp, clamp it with ties and shims and so on and so forth, and as it shrinks, it sort of grabs the book, it wraps itself around raised bands on the spine, and the result's really good. Vellum's different. I'm rapidly learning that as it dries, it does the opposite. It stretches. So the whole thing just wrinkles because it's stretching. So what I've ended up doing is I've had to put it on a frame of push pins on a piece of sheetrock, but the point is, I mean, this is how folks did it in the Middle Ages. They were forever putting vellum on wooden frames to stretch it. Why? Because as it dries, it stretches. And as it stretches, it wrinkles, which isn't what you want. So you have to keep sort of growing the frame, which in this case is push pins, in order to stop it wrinkling. It also becomes a little bit more, I guess, vulnerable, brittle, so it's more likely to actually tear as you stretch it. You know, this is a case of, you know, I really feel as though, frankly, you see, I really feel as though I'm relearning stuff that, you know, 500 years ago, anyone in the book field would have said, well, that's obvious. Well, it's 2024. It's not 1524, and it's not obvious now, because people have forgotten. And we're having to relearn, which is the act of humility, frankly, that I'm going through right now. So, there we go. As it continues to dry, it'll become opaque. So I'm hoping that all of this typeface will disappear, and we'll end up with a nice opaque sheet of vellum. But yeah, the real learning here is vellum stretches. Okay, so here in the light of the December morning is our vellum. As you can see, I actually unpinned it from the frame, probably unwisely, before it had fully dried, and just draped it over a couple of objects. And you can see it's sort of contorted a little bit, and we've got all these wrinkles. Now, the moment this gets wet, this will all disappear. But the other things to note are the original fold lines are still detectable. They sort of came back a little bit. So vellum does have a memory. So we're gonna have to be careful of this a little bit as we use this material for binding, because we don't want to flex along these pre-existing weaknesses and eventually cause it to split. As you can see, it's still somewhat translucent. It hasn't fully gone as opaque as I was expecting. If you sort of hold it up to the light, certainly you can see through. Now, will that really be visible against the surface? Probably not. But it is interesting to see how it hasn't fully darkened up. And the other thing is, if you recall, the original document was supple, and this clearly has some a little bit of stiffness to it, and I was researching why that might be, and I think, I can't be sure, but I think what was done was the document may have been treated with gelatine,
I did find a website that talked about how emergency restorations are done on damaged legal documents, and gelatine came up. So what probably happened was the gelatine got dissolved away in the sort of acid bath that we did yesterday to get rid of the ink. And once the gelatine is removed, the vellum goes back to what would be its natural kind of state, which is a little bit stiff like this, which is basically the same as you'd find on any old vellum book. So if we want to restore some suppleness to this, it may be that, particularly when we're looking at the spine of the book, maybe a little bit of gelatine might actually stop cracking. It's kind of interesting because if you look at this is a 1575 limp vellum binding, and it's interesting to actually see how similar it looks to this. It's basically ended up almost looking exactly the same. So if you just have vellum on its own without it being adhered to anything, it will naturally look like this. And as you can see here, there's a little, it's holding, but in time I suspect that's going to give right there. Now, if you look at other slightly more recent books, more of the age of the book that we're binding here, this is a 1652, and there's actually a very thin wooden board in here. And so that's kept the vellum flat. So what that says to me is it's going to be the right approach when we're restoring this Baxter, to actually keep the boards and not go for a limp vellum approach. So what we'll do is we'll remove this leather, and we'll need to really think about how to approach the vellum on this surface, because we don't want the printed block to show through. We also need to think about how the glue is going to interact with vellum, because that hasn't been done before. We're talking modern school glue. How's that going to interact with the vellum? Is it going to cause a permanent darkening or anything else that we don't want? And then the other thing we're going to have to really think about is how to do the spine in such a way that we don't actually create a permanent weakness in the vellum along the fold lines, because what we can't do is glue the vellum down. That definitely is a no-no, and with all restorations I do, I always separate it out. So like this old example, this was bound 300-400 years ago, and you can see the vellum comes away from the text block. That's why this is in good condition. So I've always tried to respect that in my own restorations. I guess one other question that's going to come with this vellum is, could we just fold it over and use a double thickness? That's another possibility. We'll get an improved level of opacity if we do that. And it'll come, I guess, closer to this. And we've got plenty of the material, so that's another potential. I suspect I could probably get, if I just cut one piece along here, will probably give us enough to actually do a double thickness binding, which would be nice. The other thing as well I'm going to do, and this is really just a tribute to the method of the time, is I'm going to fold the vellum over a little bit. So we'll have this fold in of the vellum along here, and I might even be tempted to put use a couple of strips just to put ties on, and then it'll look really cool. So that's kind of, I guess, the way forward. But in terms of the overall objective, which was to remove the ink on this side, I think that's kind of worked, and we have a good usable material here. Okay, I've separated off a strip of the vellum that we're going to use for the binding. it still has translucence, and it's also just very, very, very thin. Look at it. Very thin-skinned animal, I suppose. So I'm going to actually do a double thickness of this, I think, when we actually do the restoration. Here's the book itself. So, very, I mean, this is later paper, but even the original text book, there's fragility here. So I'm going to have to be really careful. The original spine had been caked in a, I think a wheat-based, some kind of grain-based glue. And what I've been doing here is just taking it off as gently as I can, trying to, you know, wherever possible, just get underneath it so that, there we go, I can get back to the actual tops of the gatherings, because that's what I want to be able to. Oh, that's interesting, look at that. There was originally a ribbon there. That's interesting. I may actually try and maybe put a ribbon back in then when we do the restoration a little later. You can see here I'm having to work a little harder because some of this more modern clear glue that got caked on here at some point is fighting me a little bit. So I'm going to go just a little more aggressively there. So it's interesting to think about how we want the actual boards to be reattached. So you've got 3 cross pieces here, and if you look really closely, you can see the actual raised band. Well, it's not really raised. What it is you've got the thread of the individual gatherings there, and the band actually sitting below them in a trough, in effect. So at some point, what I'm going to have to do is to get in there and see if I can remove this cross piece without doing any damage to the vertical sections, because that's literally what's holding the pages in the book. I've been working away at that carefully, and to be honest, that's probably going to be the most painstaking part of this whole thing, is removing that. The plan would be then to push a needle through, put a brand new length of thread through there, and then what I plan to do is to sister that thread with a strip of curled vellum. And the reason I want to do that is that the style for a book like this, when it was bound in vellum, was to have 3 pieces actually visible on the surface here. You'd actually see the sort of vellum ties, and a corner one here, and a corner one here. And I want to try and replicate that if I can. So although it's a little bit of a sleight of hand, although the boards themselves will be held with a piece of more traditional string, there's also going to be this vellum tie that's visible, sort of coming through in 5 places. So as you can see, I've removed this board. This board was basically falling off. And what was interesting was was how much material was actually on the board and how thin the underlying board is, which is actually really good news. I can probably demonstrate if I can get the thing to focus let's see if I can get the camera to focus. There we go. You can probably compare one board that this has the leather on, the one below, the one above I've completely cleaned. See the difference in thickness? This is incredibly light, which is great news because this vellum is very, very thin. And even at double thickness, I don't want the vellum to be carrying a great deal of weight. And it's interesting just looking at just how much physical material actually got off the board to actually come back to this finish. This blue sort of velvety paper is very common as well. That's I see that in many restoration as being sort of an undersurface onto which paper or leather's stuck. I'd like to do a bit of research on that one day to understand that more, but that seems that's quite a common thing. It might actually help me date when this last restoration was done. Okay, so what I'm going to do, this front board was slightly more firmly attached, but still very, as you can see, the ribs really were failing. I should also just add, it's also good to actually know how those threads were attached, so we can replicate it. And if you look very, very closely, it's quite difficult to see here. Let's just make sure I can see it. Yeah, there we go. You can actually see it just there. It's going to be easier this side. There we go. Goes in there, comes out there. In there, out there. In there, out there. So there are two holes basically through which this, you can actually see it there, through which this was threaded. So I'm going to reuse those holes for the repair. So anyway, here we go. I'm going to just gently separate off this board, which will, looks like, and then we'll put the text block away because that's going to need some tender loving care. It's actually interesting. What's holding it is this modern glue there. So I'm just going to fight that. Okay, so this precious little beauty I'm now going to keep safe. So now, same thing. We're now going to get underneath the leather using the bluntest knife in the house, just in one smooth movement. There's more of that blue. Take off as much weight as we can to get back to the underlying board. If anyone actually knows the history of this, I guess the phrase blue velvet, that's a whole pop song about it, but anyone who actually knows the background to this, that would be great, because I know nothing about it. That's interesting. See that? That could help us with dating. Let's see if I can make it out. There's always a history that's revealed when a book is restored. They really do act as little time capsules, and you can find just so much in it. It can actually just really help. It's actually just really interesting. It just helps date, so you get an understanding of, okay, yeah, at some point in probably the 19th century this was restored, and probably a century before that it was restored. This book's probably been through, well, I guess, several restorations in its life. This just being the latest. So we'll just, yeah, that'll about do. That's probably got rid of, it's really about removing inconsistencies in thickness and frankly just weight at this point. Same thing here, the leather's obviously folded over so we can get underneath the leather. That'll enable an easy removal, like this. There we go, that's what it
under the leather if we can. It doesn't always work. Let's see if we can do it from this side here. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Our leather fold over is where there's a lot of weight. Let me just continue this process. So we've gotten rid of as much of this later material as we can. And the other objective, again, is just to, if we can, expose where the holes are, where the bands were threaded. Oh, that's useful. Okay. Yeah. There you go. Right there. One there, one there. And I'm pretty sure there'll be one under there as well. Let's see if we can get to it. There we are. That's gotten rid of the leather. So, a little bit there I'll continue scraping at, but basically we're back now to the original boards. They're incredibly thin and light, which is great. Okay.